what intelligence really is and whether AI is intelligent or not. And it's causing a lot of confusion to people because they think an information synthesizer, which is what it really is. It has access to large pools of information. We don't know if all of it is validated. I'm sure it has bias built in. But I suppose it gives people a sense of power and extension when they feel that they have access to intelligence. I listen with extreme depth because in that listening, I understand assumptions. I hear hidden values. I see blind spots. And it gives me the tools necessary to ask questions. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about something which is not a position, not a title. We're talking about a set of behaviors that can change the future of an organization.
What's one of the recent discoveries or discussions that caught your attention?
A discussion on what intelligence really is and whether AI is intelligent or not. And it's causing a lot of confusion to people because they think, I think it's a misnomer to call it artificial intelligence because it's not intelligence. It's programming, it's information gathering, but we confuse knowledge with competence. And very often that can mislead people in terms of what they expect.
That's really interesting. Go ahead, Becky.
I know, I was just going to ask Fay, so you said that you think that the naming artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer. Just out of interest, what would you name it instead?
I would call it information synthesizer, an information synthesizer, which is what it really is. It has access to large pools of information. We don't know if all of it is validated. I'm sure it has bias built in, as we can see in some of the lawsuits that are ongoing with recruitment software, recruitment AI. And but I suppose it gives people a sense of power and extension when they feel that they have access to intelligence.
Good point.
With human quote unquote intelligence, one thing that surprised me was Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and the notion that a lot of what we think is our agency might be pre-programmed. Also, the logical versus emotional decision-making and the myriad biases that we fall victim to, confirmation bias, selectivity bias, et cetera. What would you describe as human intelligence?
Well, human intelligence is driven very much by our need to survive and our ability to read context, understand danger. We have built-in emotional sensors and senses that give us input as to, what danger we may be under. And as a result of that, we respond to many things that we're not necessarily fully conscious of. But it's all driven around our ability to read context, respond to it, interact with our environment, and we're making conscious and unconscious choices that will give us, the short-term, immediate gratification necessary for survival. And if we don't make the right choices, we simply don't survive.
So by that rationale, if we were to put in an algorithm into AI that it needed to survive, do you think it would become intelligent?
No, it would not become intelligent. It might become dangerous.
Why?
Because then you will not be able to stop it. If you say it has to survive, that may mean it needs to be disobedient. And I wonder, human disobedience can lead to a lack of survival. Right? But machine disobedience, I don't know. I don't know how far we've experimented with that.
So I'm wondering then, do you see intelligence and consciousness as separate things and they don't need to coexist for one to have the other?
They definitely interact with each other. Consciousness is something that is affected by many different factors in our environment. We have senses. We pick up cues and vibrations from other people that we interpret and we respond to it. And that's really how other people respond to us too.
Because I wonder, because you'd mentioned, and you're right, a lot of what we do is unconscious. We have those
Yes,
senses essentially in our bodies that are happening with or without us being aware of it. I
exactly.
wonder if that counts more as intelligence, almost from a machine perspective. The machine is doing what it needs to do. And therefore, could you have intelligence that reacts the way it needs to react, but not be conscious of it, not be aware that that's happening?
Absolutely. Our autonomic nervous system is running the most complex, cross-functional systems within our bodies to keep us alive. If we were trying to do that consciously, we'd be dead in a second. But conscious effort is overrated because we are not always doing things which are necessarily rational. We have chemical interactions with our brain affected by our moods. We have emotional impulses. We have cues which come in through our senses. And when you mention confirmation bias, what our brain does is that it will delete, distort, and generalize to maintain the confirmation bias so that our view of reality is aligned with what we think it is. And that's quite challenging, because when you're dealing with other people, they have their own model of reality, right? And so when it comes to leadership, which is what I work with, how do you get a team of people in a leadership team to speak the same language, to get on the same page and share a purpose that is strong enough for them to disagree and yet remain as a cohesive team and act together? That's a challenge. That's what I enjoy doing. That's what I do. I work with individuals. I always start with the individual leader, and I go through their business emotional intelligence profile with them in a private and confidential meeting. So it creates a sense of introspection and a sense of humility before we get together. So they're not coming to the, if you like, the group session with arrogance and confidence that they might otherwise have. And so that's a really important starting point, because we all have a model of reality. We all have a conviction of why we think we do what we do. And decision making, which is what leadership really is about, is driven by our thoughts and emotions. And when a leader makes a decision, it's not just impacting them, it's impacting their immediate circle, their organization, and depending on how the scope of their leadership looks, they could be affecting the world. So yes.
You describe your work as non-invasive neurosurgery. Could you explain
That's
what
right.
that means?
What that means is, when I have a conversation with my clients, and they're typically leaders, I listen with extreme depth, because in that listening, I understand assumptions. I hear hidden values. I see blind spots, and it gives me the tools necessary to ask questions, so that it's almost as if we go through a dissection of identifying what's getting in their way. I'll give you an example so it's concrete. People would say, I want to become the CEO in 2 years. But when you look at their values, their beliefs, and their rules, you realize that that's not possible with that set of, supposing someone says, one of my values is humility. And how do you play humility? What are your beliefs about humility? And they would say something like, well, I really don't like to brag about myself. Say, can you talk about yourself without bragging? And then the rule is, in their mind, that someone else should promote them. They shouldn't be promoting themselves. So now that person is locked into a loop that is standing in their way. And they question you. Typically what happens when people are in these loops, there is a recurrent question that keeps coming up for them over and over again. And for such an individual, the question might be, why do they not see me when it's time for promotion? why am I overlooked? And by uncovering those values and beliefs and rules that they have embedded in their mind probably from childhood, we can begin to unravel the complexity and, in a way, change the rules, find different ways of satisfying the values and the needs. And that is why I describe what I do as non-invasive neurosurgery, because it's asking people to reorganize, refocus the way they think about themselves and the limitations they place on themselves unconsciously. What we call in everyday language blind spots. That's what a blind spot is. When you don't see what's standing in your way. And that's you very often.
Most of the time, I would think.
Yes.
It makes me think, Faye, when you were talking about rules, the social rules that we have. So I'll give you a vague example, but a personal one.
Mm-hmm.
If you have, and it might be a generational thing, it might be, like you said, from how people are raised, an expectation on a member of a family. They believe that the, let's say, younger generation should be the one to start communication, right? So, for
Yes.
example, that they must call me. If the younger generation don't have the same rules, then they don't follow the rules of the older generation. And then there might be an unnecessary set of feelings that come with that on every side. So I'm wondering, applying it to leadership, you have a leader that might have a set of rules, what they expect of themselves, but also what they expect of others, that doesn't match with the set of rules that their team has. Coaching the leader helps, but what are ways to bridge the gap between the unspoken and often what we're unaware of in terms of the rules that we have if they're different?
That's exactly what we do in our group coaching sessions, Becky. So to give you an example, when it comes to decision making, I'll take the example of decision making. I use diagnostic tools, so I have scientific evidence for people, personalized scientific evidence that says you prefer to make decisions quite slowly. You want to gain consensus before you make a decision. You want to have everyone's buy-in, but that's pretty risky when you're dealing with circumstances that are changing fast, or there is high risk, or there's an opportunity that may be lost. On the other hand, you have someone who wants to take decisions quite fast, and they become impatient with details, so they don't listen to the details. And therefore, they want to rush ahead. Now, these two people see each other as adversaries because their unconscious rules are their behavior, what feels right to them. That so-called comfort zone. And so they look at each other and they will criticize one another. And one will say, you're being very impulsive, you're not listening to the details. And the other one would say, you're being very slow and timid in terms of taking the initiative. So when I have the initial individual meetings with people in leadership teams, we go through the private conversation with them so they know their own liabilities and strengths. And when we get in the room and we have a group of people, we actually have visuals and maps that show using color coding, the difference between myself and you, for example. We have a red line between us on decision making. Now, why is that there? What does it mean? How does it impact the business? And we do get into the practical conversations of how it helps and when it helps and what to do about it. How to begin to value the different approaches to thinking. And we don't only limit it to decision making. We look at motivation, we look at influence, we look at adaptability, we look at conscientiousness, stress resilience, so many things that can impact the future of an organization. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about something which is not a position, not a title. We're talking about a set of behaviors that can change the future of an organization or the future of a family business. And just very very much, like you said, the unwritten rules that were never spoken about. We don't trust each other enough. We make assumptions about you're old-fashioned, you expect me to speak, or you don't care about me, that's why you're not talking to me. And I do quite a few programs exclusively for women, and I call it the Impostorella syndrome, just like Cinderella. The Impostorella syndrome, where they tiptoe, meaning you're waiting for permission and you wonder why you're not treated as a leader. Leaders don't wait for permission, they act. And then when they do take action, people say, well, you have the initiative, you have the agency, you have the confidence. So getting a team of leaders, and I'm talking leadership teams, so everybody is a leader in their own domain, to have those conversations with each other is a challenge that I truly enjoy. And by the end of a 2-day group coaching session, when we agree on, so what's our purpose? Why are we here together? What value do we add? What would the company lose if we all disappeared tomorrow? And that's a hard question for them to answer. I mean, what would you lose if you weren't there? Because operationally, functional, repetitive work is going to go on without them. Right? That's going to be AI. It's repetitive, it's predictable, it's manageable. You need input data. However, what are you contributing as a human leader to an organization? And what's our future role as leaders? How do we talk to each other? How do we create cohesion rather than a consensus? Consensus, by definition, is compromises on all sides. But when you have a robust purpose that everybody agrees to, we can have some arguments and still remain friends because we're arguing about the modality of achieving our purpose rather than a personal issue. So
yeah, it's the how, not the what or the why.
Yes, we've agreed on the why. We've agreed that if we were gone tomorrow, something would be lost, and that thing that would be lost is our ability to connect people to purpose, to outputs through the way we communicate, not only with one another, but the way we transmit the messages throughout the organization.
You wrote about living on shifting sands of uncertainty, which is something
Yes.
I think more and more people can relate to these days. What does that teach you about leadership that stable environments may not?
You have to assume that you could die tomorrow. And making that assumption means you're always planning for what happens when you're not there. When I raised 4 children through war, I made sure that I have 2 boys and 2 girls. I made sure that they all knew to fix a car, to cook, to find their way around, to do whatever it took to survive without any gender bias. So living with the assumption that you may not be around tomorrow, which is very real, creates resilience. It creates adaptability. It creates a sense of passing on what you know and what you have and sharing resources in a different way than if you assume you're going to be around for another 100 years. So you narrow your focus, you plan for the immediate, future, what's coming next. And if you don't do that, you go crazy because you have zero control over what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think we realize how little control we have over our lives. We assume that, trains will run and we'll be able to go to the supermarket and get our resources, and we'll do all of those assumptions are pretty tenuous and fragile.
Heard the saying, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And I think that
Exactly.
perfectly encapsulates that.
Absolutely. So you have to just assume that you have no control. You cannot predict. But at the same time, you need to live and do what needs to be done today, because if you don't do, you won't eat. If you don't do, you won't get business. So you have to keep doing in spite of that knowledge that you may not be around. And that's my definition of resilience. Continuing to do what you need to do, knowing that you have no control.
You mentioned these loops that people have that your non-invasive neurosurgery helps them with. And that reminds me of what a professor mentions as the many constructs that we have in our world building, our sense of self, etc. And what's interesting is that most of those are formed from a moment in time, but we're living through fluid time. Like you're
Yes.
mentioning the shifting sands of uncertainty. So there's this interesting kind of contradiction where we're continually trying to model the past on the present. One way to change the constructs that this professor mentioned, she used this analogy of like a teapot. And you need to open the lid of the teapot in order to get to the construct inside. And that takes dysregulation. Dysregulation
Yes.
can be traumatic. Often these constructs were forced in traumatic situations. And the change that we're constantly going through, I'm curious, what are your thoughts with your approach to helping people deal with their constructs and, I guess, kind of quantum superposition, simultaneously make new constructs but not get too attached to them?
That's a really interesting perspective. And, one of the ways in which I have successfully, I hope, given people a different perspective is put them in a role that's not theirs. So when we do a simulation, for example, we have roles like CEO and sales manager and finance manager. CEO would never, ever be put in a role of CEO. Most probably in production, in a role that requires logistics and planning. And you put someone else in the role of CEO. By putting people in a role that they don't normally fulfill, but they're very happy to point fingers at the people who are in those roles and saying, how inept they are, is a huge eye-opener, because they panic. I've had people cry in simulations because they have found it very, very difficult to cope with that new role. But what is created is you create professional empathy, where people now recognize that what they thought was so easy or so, simple is not. And by understanding the challenges of those other roles, they are forced to reassess their construct of what constitutes success, and that you are not the only contributor to success. So that in a way forces systems thinking, because after the simulation, which is quite shocking and in some ways traumatic to some people, because they're frozen, they find that they may not be able to do anything. They have to talk to each other. They have to ask where the hidden information is. They have to find out, how can I help you? How can you help me? What do you actually need? Where is that information? Maybe we need to stop and reassess what we're doing and look at how we connect the dots together. So that's one way of getting a radical reassessment of constructs. We did this for an emergency room in a hospital, and this was before AI, so it was actually physically done like theater. And I have a background in theater, and I've used that quite extensively. So we had the sound effects of the ambulances and the beepers and everything. And we put doctors in the role of nurses and nurses in the role of doctors, and played the roles around. And we used, because we obviously couldn't use human beings, we used electronic board that they had to repair. And we brought in equipment like oscilloscopes and other electronic equipment where they had to repair the units. And the KPIs were how many patients were processed. And at the end of the first round, they had killed 17 patients. Well, the electronic boards, not the patient. And
Point
so
taken.
that was shocking to them. And then they had to sit down and reassess what they were doing. And by the time we got to round 3, they were actually performing and they improved like threefold. And they were astonished by that improvement. It was a half a day, but it took a long time to plan and design and get the workflow. We actually had a huge hall, and we had, pasted the floor plan, and people went through that experience. But at the end of it, they actually redesigned their workflows and their systems. But it's because we don't see, we go through life on autopilot. We don't see what's in front of us. And by putting people in a situation which, like you said, David, you change their paradigm, you shift things for them, they have to look at it differently by necessity. And then when they sit together and you have that collective intelligence, when I talk about diversity, I talk about cognitive diversity. You and I don't think the same. And if we can appreciate that different way of thinking and be open to challenge, we're going to make, much better decisions and be able to solve problems in a short time. We've had people outperform their peers in the same market when we've gone through these leadership team developments, because we did not provide the solution as consultants. We created the environment necessary for them to find the solution themselves, because there is nothing more convincing than confirmation bias, right? You create your own world, you create your own facts, you have experiential evidence, and you are convinced that you got it right. You found the key, you found the solution, therefore I don't need to persuade you. You've persuaded yourself. And so I enjoy the challenge of designing the learning experience, and it's never the same for any two organizations. We don't have off the shelf. We have components, very much like a Lego system, where we can get different components and put them together. But understanding the context, understanding the relationship, understanding animosity, understanding who likes, who dislikes each other. As humans, emotions get in the way. Thoughts lead to feelings. Feelings lead to actions. Actions lead to results. And if you don't like the results you're getting, you need to go back and re-examine the thoughts you had in the first place. What were you thinking?
Do you ever encounter people who, because I wonder if maybe self-awareness is a big key to this. To your point, most of us are not aware most of the time anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that loop, thoughts become feelings, become actions, become results, become thoughts. It's that cycle that
Yes.
happens there. There are lots of people, myself included, that may be in the cycle of committing actions that come from thoughts and feelings that create results and not being aware that I'm the one that created the result.
Absolutely.
Which it's very easy to see from the outside, right? Well, that person
Yes.
keeps doing this and it's their own fault. For example, they have issues with every partner or every boss or every whatever.
Uh-huh.
How do you help those people? Where in that cycle is easiest to get them so that they can notice it for themselves? Is it in the thoughts? Is it in a change of action and putting them in a different environment? How do we do that?
I think with those people who are not getting the results they want, they will tell you they're very self-aware. But self-aware is nothing. Self-aware is kind of self-congratulation. And people will say, yes, I know I made that mistake, but this is me, which is resistance. They don't want to change. So the question to ask them is to stop and say, who do you think is at fault? And do you have any control over those people? What control do you have? What can you change? And lead them to discover that they really have no control over anyone but themselves. Generally, people who face this resistance to look at themselves, because we don't learn from mistakes. That's a false assumption. We learn from reflection on mistakes and then picking it apart and seeing what what it is that we have control over. So getting them to that stage of why did this go wrong? What happened? What were your assumptions? What were you expecting? How can you change it? Is literally dissecting that formula for them and going back to what it is that they assumed. What is it that you had assumed would happen? And those are in our blind spots. When people assume that someone else should be doing something, or if I'm the CEO, like you were saying, people should come to me, I shouldn't go to them. Especially in cultures where you have high power distance, where people don't challenge the leader, or people have been taught obedience and compliance to the point where they don't raise any objections and they go along over the cliff.
Your office was bombed and years of work were destroyed.
Mhm.
And during that period, you made 3 life-changing decisions. Could
Yes.
you elaborate on what they were and what each one cost you?
Yes. Arriving at 8 o'clock in the morning, supposedly to an office, and finding nothing but wreckage and smoke was quite a shock. But when things feel normal and feel routine, even though you're living in a war, I always think of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. When you're living in a war, it's a surreal world, but you're living in it as if it's real, it's reality. You go through this. So you begin to create stories for yourself about what's right and what's wrong. So my husband was alcoholic. It was a real problem because he wasn't working. And I was trying to support my family, 4 children and a husband and a sick mother. And seeing that office turned to trash, it meant my whole life was really turned to nothing. And I decided, no, I was not going to continue tolerating an extra load on my back that I didn't need. So that was the first decision, to make that really, really hard decision. I felt sorry for him because I understood that there is an addiction. It wasn't out of hatred, but out of, I cannot cope with that load as well as do everything else I needed to do. And I had to choose my priorities, and my children came first. So that was decision number one. And the process of separating and, having him go back to his home, for which I paid. There's no alimony, and there's no, in that system, there was nothing. So I had to rely on myself. So that was the first realization, that I didn't need an additional burden. I needed to be free to do what I needed to do. The second was my eldest son was ready for university, and keeping him in a country where there was, potential death was maybe not the best solution. So he had been accepted at State University of New York. I borrowed money. I sent him on a hydrofoil from Lebanon to Cyprus. And he went on from there to university in the United States, where he still lives and works as a robotics engineer. Very accomplished person. But, if you can imagine the scene of watching the bombs falling next to a boat in which your child is going, that was another decision that was pretty life-changing. And then I decided I was going to go out and start my own business, because I did not feel that my values were aligned with the values of the university. And this was a time, we get attached to things. I've put in 17 years of work. How could I leave that? How could I walk away from that? But when it was destroyed, in a way, it was liberating, because it meant there was nothing to tie me there anymore. And that is when I started my business, at first as a freelancer. And it was the belief, and I'm using that word, belief and conviction, that I had the knowledge and I had the perseverance and the capacity to go out and be a consultant. And at that time, I started out as an educational consultant, going around to schools, working with them to change the whole system of education from rote learning to more critical thinking, to more experiential learning. And that was tough. I spent a lot of time in the car driving from one zone to the next. And I didn't have a big financial cushion at all. I had to make it. But when you face existential situations like that and you ask yourself, when everything is stripped away, status and titles and all of that, who are you really at your core? And what are you willing to do for the people you love and care about? And when you find those answers, and that's what I help my clients to find the answers for themselves, not my answers, their answers. This is incredibly liberating because it gives you the inner strength of knowing who you are, what you will not compromise on, and what you're willing to do no matter what. And that is, I believe, the foundation of motivation. Having autonomy, knowing you depend on yourself. You're not going to be rewarded by anybody but yourself, and that you have important people to support, and you have the belief in yourself and your resources and your capability to do it. That's what happens when everything is stripped away. Your energy becomes incandescent.
Upon reflection at that time, that so much changed, and like you said, you're living in a surreal reality, and probably, at least hopefully, it's not something that a lot of people have experienced that might be listening to this podcast.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a weird question. Based on what it taught you about yourself and the decisions that came from it, upon reflection, are you grateful for the experience?
Yes, because otherwise I would have continued living in a fantasy world with false problems and looking for people to blame. And when you look for people to blame, you don't take responsibility. So what applies to people in a world where there is more stability and there's more predictability is don't confuse your comfort zone and your predictability with a fulfilling life, because it's a routine life. And if you accept that life without questioning who you really are at your core and what you want and what matters to you, you haven't got the full value of your potential as a person. You haven't tasted the flavor of what you could be when you allow yourself to become who you were meant to be. And I really, the best reward I get is not the money. The best reward I get is when a client tells me, you have changed my life and you have shown me who I am. And that is incredibly rewarding to me and to them.
I can
Because
imagine.
people don't know they have power. We give our power away because we think it belongs to somebody else and that they are going to do it for us. And there's nobody who's going to do anything for you in that way. People may be nice, they may be supportive, they may be good friends, but no one can, touch your core and help you to recognize who you truly are unless you're willing to put that work in. I have a program called The 4 Journeys of a Leader, and that's exactly what I do. It begins with what I call a personal odyssey, of people diving deep into who they are and what matters to them and what will they not compromise on. And then who do you surround yourself with? And how do you make it happen? And then how do you go to the last level, which is, the freedom to be yourself, to be unashamedly yourself. If people don't like it, it's their problem, not yours.
You've written Gordian knots on leadership
Yes.
dilemmas. What's one knot you wish every leader would sit with more?
The line that I call sadism and stupidity. It's very, very hard to draw a line between what is deliberately cruel and stupid. And that line is one we debate with and struggle with all the time. And asking ourselves, is it weak to be compassionate? Is it weakness to look at yourself and give yourself, credit, and at the same time look outward at other people and consider if true leadership is one that takes people on the journey with them, or do we need to destroy them? Leadership and power are not the same thing. And it would be really worthwhile to reflect on that line between, being intelligent, using our intelligence and our compassion as human beings, and not confusing it with short-term gratification, which can come out as real, cruelty at times. It may give people a sense of power and strength to believe that they could, impose on others, but it's very hard to differentiate which is which at times. And I would take the advice of, saying it's stupidity rather than deliberate cruelty whenever I can. But it's not an easy line to draw. But I think it's one that's extremely important in our world today.
For somebody that might be maybe they haven't explored themselves yet, they haven't
Yes.
done some of the reflection that you've discussed, or maybe they're a new leader and this is the start of them developing into that. What's a practical first step that you think people could take that can help them get started on this journey of self-reflection and discovery?
Ask themselves, what are the 3 most important decisions they have made in their lives? The decisions where they struggled maybe for weeks, months, even years to come to that decision, because those decisions that are almost like you're at a crossroads and you have to decide whether you're going to go north, south, east, or west, those decisions are defining moments in your life. And when you identify those, that's the first way to say what my values are. Because our values are sometimes quite unconscious, but every single decision we take, conscious or not, is informed by those values. It's what shapes our character, our personality. And finding out those 3 most difficult, most crucial decisions, and they follow a pattern. When when I work with people, I identify what their basic human needs are, and those 3 life-changing decisions are like peeling the onion away so they can see what's at the core. What are those non-negotiable values for them? That's why they struggle to do the decision. What's expected of me? What's my comfort zone? What do I really want? Am I able to compromise? Am I willing to do that? So that is a first step. I think other things that people can do is to really get some interesting personality psychometric profiling. The psychometric profiling by itself is insufficient. You need to have a really competent person who will debrief that with you and question you and challenge you and push you so that you uncover your assumptions that are keeping you, in the same spot. And, you're running on that treadmill, but you're not getting anywhere. So that would be a very important first step.
Where can people find you and where should they begin with your work?
To have a first meeting with me, just to have a conversation. And whether they're corporate or individual, I'm on LinkedIn. My email is fay@ictn.com. Easy. And I can send these to you if that's required.
Sure, it doesn't hurt. But yeah, I'm happy to put that in the show notes. Well, this was a fascinating conversation. I just want to give you the floor if there's anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't ask you or anything you want to close with. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to say that leadership is a gift. It's not something that we should take for granted. It's not your title. And you could be anybody and be a leader. Take it seriously because you affect the lives of many people. People look at you And we don't have enough people who qualify as good leaders. And what I mean by a good leader is someone who cares about the world outside of themselves, having the inner integrity and the outer credibility is an absolutely essential a feature of good leadership, because then your word matters. People take you seriously. The biggest challenge people have today is when I say to them, who are some leaders you admire? And you have silence. Having the integrity, which is knowing who you are and showing the world who you are consistently, is credibility. When they work together, you are an extremely powerful person because your word lands and you have that consistency and you have the ability to make change. People will comply with you when you just use force or position authority. They don't really care about you. You disappear from their memory and from their consciousness when you turn your back.
Well said. Becky, is there anything that you wanted to ask before we close?
No, I think there was multiple threads that I wanted to pull on as we were going through, but I think they'd open up much longer conversations.
same.
But it was fascinating to talk to you, Faye, and hear about, because it's not just about leadership at a here are some techniques level. It's a much deeper reflection on who I am, what makes me me, what are my blind spots that I think actually everybody could do with, not just leaders. Everybody needs to have that level of
Absolutely.
introspection.
And we don't have enough of that. We don't have enough critical thinking. I always say, how can you have a democracy when you don't have highly educated, informed people who are capable of critical thinking? That's a real challenge, because then knowing what I know in psychology, knowing what I know about the media and the capabilities that we have and marketing, it is very, very easy to engineer decisions. Very easy.
I'm glad that you did the work that you did in schools, and I think it should be in every school, everywhere, that people learn how to do this from a younger age as well. Coming back to the neuroscience element of it, I think the younger the better to develop those
Yes.
habits and that awareness.
I do it now with adults in companies. We work with a lot of very large multinationals, and I've worked with maybe 40, 50 different nationalities, people of different cultures, people of different backgrounds, and they're all the same. There's so much alike. We like to talk about differences, but we forget that we are all human at base.